Welcome back to the deep dive, where we deliver the architectural shortcuts, the administrative gotchas, and really the knowledge you need to be not just compliant, but genuinely competent. Today, we are taking one of the densest areas of cloud administration, a real beast, cross-tenant identity management, and we're going to try and turn it into pure, actionable knowledge for you.
Yeah, we're strapping on our identity safety harnesses today. We're descending deep into Microsoft Entra ID and specifically the really complex rules that govern identity boundaries. If you are preparing for the AZ 104 Azure Administrator exam, or if you simply live in a multi-tenant world dealing with partners, mergers, and external automation, this is absolutely the deep dive you've been waiting for.
Our mission today is, I think, all about precision. We aren't just going to summarize the documentation. We are dissecting 15 intensely specific scenarios, these little nuggets of knowledge that really define the perimeter of modern security. We're going to make sure that the subtle differences between these scenarios really stick in your mind. So when you see them on a screen, you know exactly which configuration blade to open and, well, exactly which permission to assign.
That immediacy of clarity is the goal. It really is. In complex, sprawling environments, the hardest thing to define is that security perimeter, where an identity starts, where it's managed, and critically, where it is allowed to cross a tenant boundary. We need to move beyond just, simple user creation and really master the nuances of cross-tenant trust, the authorization flow, and policy enforcement.
And before we can even begin to tackle any of the specific scenarios, we have to set the stage. There are three core types of identities we'll be dealing with. Every single solution we talk about hinges on you correctly identifying which of these three you are working with.
That's absolutely right. Think of these as the fundamental identity archetypes in the Azure landscape. If you misidentify the actor, you're going to choose the wrong tool for the job every single time.
So who are the three main players on our stage today?
Okay, first up, we have B2B guests. Think of these as your external humans. This covers everyone from, say, a long-term contractor and a partner consultant to a temporary employee from a company you just acquired. The key feature here is that their identity, their password, their lifecycle, all of it is managed entirely by their home organization, but they are granted access rights in your tenant.
Okay, so that's the human element. What's number two?
The second category is service principals, or SPS. These are your external automation identities. They represent applications or services that need to access your resources, but the application itself is registered and owned outside of your tenant. So, think of third-party SaaS platforms or partner scripts running on their own infrastructure.
Got it. And the last one?
And finally, we have managed identities, MIs. These are your internal automation identities. If you have an Azure function, a virtual machine, or an app service that needs to access another Azure resource, like a key vault or a storage account, within the same Azure environment, you use an MI. These are by far the simplest to manage, but they come with the strictest geographic and administrative boundaries. We'll definitely get into that.
Okay, if you can just hold on to that taxonomy guest for external people, SP for external automation, and MI for internal tenant local automation, you have already secured the foundational knowledge for, half of the questions on this topic. Let's start with the most common challenge, the human factor.
Right. When organizations start collaborating, identity friction is just, it's inevitable. We use B2B or business to business to manage this. It's the standard for external human access, but there are multiple crucial configuration steps required to make it secure and seamless.
So let's begin with scenario one, the contractor access. This is a simple administrative need. We have a consultant from a partner company who needs temporary read-write access to a specific resource group for, say, a 3-month project.
The intuitive mistake, the one many admins make, especially if they're new to Entra ID, is falling back to the old mindset. I'll just create a user account for them directly in my directory. That way I control the password, the MFA, the whole life cycle.
Okay, I'm going to play devil's advocate here for a second. Why is that the wrong move? Creating a local Entra account gives me full immediate control. If I want to cut their access at 5 p.m. on a Friday, I can just hit delete. Why add the complexity of B2B?
Well, the thing is, the complexity is actually the security feature.
Yeah.
If you create that local account, you inherit all the management overhead, password rotation, MFA setup, and most critically, offboarding. Think about it. If that contractor leaves their company unexpectedly, their local account in your system remains active until you manually delete it. And how would you even know they left?
I probably wouldn't. Not right away, anyway.
Exactly. The security advantage of B2B is that their identity remains managed by their home tenant. If they are fired or they resign, Their home tenant disables their corporate account, and boom, access to your resources is instantaneously revoked. It's an immediate, zero-friction security boundary.
That makes the governance argument extremely sticky. I get it.
Yeah.
So the correct solution for the exam and the real world is B2B guest access. You invite their existing corporate email as a guest user, and then you assign the necessary RBAC roles.
Precisely. But now we hit the first real-world architectural wrinkle. What if the contractor tries to sign in, but their home tenant has these super restrictive outgoing conditional access policies or some legacy infrastructure that just blocks external sign-ins? You've done your part correctly, but they still can't get past the login screen.
That sounds like a silent roadblock, a frustrating one that only an administrator on both sides can actually diagnose and fix.
It is. And this is where you need to configure the cross-tenant access settings in your intra-tenant. You must explicitly establish an organizational relationship with their tenant and configure it to allow inbound B2B authentication. If you fail to do this, the trust relationship isn't fully established, and the connection just fails before the user even gets to your resources.
Yeah.
So the key takeaway for the exam is the identification. External human always means guest user, B2B, but sometimes that requires cross-tenant access settings configuration to establish that trust.
Right, and we see the utility of this temporary bridge in our next scenario, scenario 3, the company merger. So company A acquires company B, and there is an immediate critical need for employees of company B to access certain resources in company A's tenant, but they are months, maybe even a year away from a full, painful tenant migration.
This is a massive organizational trap. I've seen it happen. The common desperate thought process, oh no, we must start the migration now. But tenant migration is an arduous process. It involves identity cleanup, resource remapping, data transfer. It is never the short-term answer.
So the temporary solution is to essentially treat the acquired company's users just like we treated the contractors.
Precisely. The correct, immediate solution is identical. Enable cross-tenant access, and then follow that with B2B guest invitations for the required users or groups from the acquired company. This is what rapid response architecture looks like. It's fast, it's entirely reversible if the deal sours, and it requires zero data migration. It allows the acquired users to leverage their existing credentials immediately.
So it effectively buys the administrators 6 to 12 months of planning time, which is invaluable. I noticed the source material pointed out in advanced detail here. The ability to enable cross-tenant B2B for groups. How does that change the administrative effort?
Oh, it radically improves governance. It's a game changer. Historically, you had to invite individual B2B guests. If Team Alpha needed access, you were sitting there inviting 20 individual people. With cross-tenant B2B for groups, you can define a dynamic group in the acquired tenant, tenant B, and then use that group's object ID to grant access in tenant A. Now, membership changes. People joining or leaving Team Alpha in their home directory automatically flow into the access management in your tenant. It consolidates governance and greatly eases the administrative burden.
Okay, so we've gotten the identity through the door using B2B. Now comes the second phase of friction, which is authorization. This brings us right to scenario 4, the authorization gap. The guest user logs in successfully, they pass MFA, the trust works, but they immediately hit access denied errors when trying to view something really basic, like the list of available virtual machines.
The intuition here is so dangerous, especially for the exam. You think, well, if they authenticated successfully, surely they must have inherited a baseline permission, maybe a read access, just to see the environment structure.
But I'm guessing that's not how it works at all.
That intuition will fail you every time. The crucial non-negotiable rule is that B2B guest accounts have NO implicit permissions. Zero. Nada. B2B identity grants authentication proof of who they are, but absolutely not authorization. These are two entirely separate security steps.
It's the difference between showing your ID to get into the building and having a key card that actually opens the office doors.
That is the perfect analogy. You still need the key card. Therefore, the fix for scenario 4 is mandatory. You must assign explicit RBAC roles to that guest user, or, add them to an existing group in your tenant that already holds the required RBAC role. The core exam trap is this realization. Guest access equals identity only. You have to follow up with authorization every single time.
And this principle is often tested in very specific data plane contexts, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Which leads us to scenario 13, log analytics specifics. We have a third-party SOC analyst who is a B2B guest, and they need to read security logs contained in a log analytics workspace.
The lazy admin approach, the one that feels right, is to give them the standard reader role at the subscription level. You're thinking, the workspace is inside the subscription, so this covers it.
But I'm guessing this fails because log analytics doesn't play by the general RBAC rules.
It fails spectacularly. The correct solution is to invite them as a guest, of course, but then you must assign the log analytics reader role specifically scoped to the workspace. The subscription reader role is a control plane permission. It lets them see resource properties. The log analytics data plane, the actual logs, operates on its own distinct RBAC structure. If you only give them subscription reader, they might see that the workspace exists, but they can't query a single line of data within it.
So data plane permissions must always be assigned explicitly at the workspace level.
Always. This is a classic detail designed to differentiate between admins who generalize permissions and those who understand resource-specific boundaries.
Okay, let's move from simple access to establishing trust and enforcing unified security policies. This brings in the complexity of conditional access. So scenario 5, cross-tenant MFA trust. We have a robust conditional access policy requiring multi-factor authentication for all sign-ins. A B2B guest tries to sign in, but they hit an error or get stuck in a loop because your CA policy is fighting with how their home tenant handles MFA.
Ugh, this used to be a huge pain point. The pre-modern solution was either forcing the guest to register for your tenant's MFA, which leads to a terrible user experience with multiple authenticator apps.
Right, nobody wants that.
Or, even worse, creating an exclusion group for all guests, which just completely compromises your security posture.
So neither of those is acceptable in a secure enterprise environment. What's the right administrative fix today?
The secure fix is to utilize the trust settings within the cross-tenant access settings. You go in there and you explicitly enable MFA trust. What this does is it tells your Entra ID, hey, if their home tenant, tenant B, asserts a valid MFA claim in the token they send us, we will trust it and satisfy our own CA policy requirement. This prevents those duplicate MFA prompts and significantly improves the guest experience while maintaining your security.
That's a huge architectural win. But what if the partner is less secure? What if their external tenant does not enforce MFA for that user? Does enabling MFA trust suddenly mean we're compromising our security?
No, and this is the beautiful part of the architecture. If you configure the trust but their home tenant fails to enforce MFA, your tenant's conditional access policy simply takes over and triggers the MFA prompt itself using your settings. You have a secured fallback. The exam point here is knowing that this trust isn't automatic. It must be explicitly configured in the cross-tenant access console.
Now, let's talk lifecycle management. This brings us to scenario 8, guest user governance. Over years of collaboration, your organization has accumulated hundreds, maybe thousands, of B2B guest accounts. Security compliance now requires that all external accounts have their access reviewed by resource owners every 90 days.
The old way of doing this, it's painful to even think about. Exporting a list to Excel, emailing it to a bunch of resource owners, waiting for responses, and then manually disabling accounts.
Yeah.
It's administratively impossible at scale. That's the wrong answer.
So we need an automated system, something that handles the notifications, the attestation, and the enforcement for us.
Correct. The Azure native solution here is access reviews, which you'll find within Entra Identity Governance. You set up a recurring review, you target the group of all external users, and you define the frequency, like quarterly. Then you define the reviewer, say, the owner of the resource group, the guest's access. If the reviewer doesn't attest that the guest still needs access within the deadline, the system automatically removes the guest's access rights. This is the compliance standard for managing the complex but necessary life cycle of external accounts.
And that shifts the governance burden from the central security team to the resource owner, which is really where it belongs. Let's finish this human section with a really subtle configuration issue. Scenario 15, group claim issues. So we've successfully invited a guest, assigned them to a security group in our tenant, and that group has the right RBAC roles. But when the user signs in, their application access fails because the security group membership is missing from their authentication token.
This is a classic silent killer issue. It's so frustrating to troubleshoot. The administrator assumes that, group membership is automatically included in the token once the user is authenticated. But group claims for B2B guests are not included by default.
Why are they excluded by default? Is that a security measure or performance?
It's a bit of both, but it's primarily for performance and privacy. Group membership can dramatically increase the size of the authentication token, which can cause issues with older applications that can't handle very large tokens. Plus, sharing your internal group structure is often considered sensitive security data you don't want to just broadcast.
Got it. So how do we force Entra to include those group claims for the external user?
This requires explicit configuration in a couple places. First, In your cross-tenant access settings, you have to enable external group membership claims. That's the first gate. Second, and this is the one that's often missed, you may need to specifically configure the application registration itself to emit groups as claims and ensure support B2B group expansion is active if the external user is relying on, say, nested group membership for authorization. Without this explicit configuration, the authorization token they receive is just too thin, and any group-based RBAC will fail.
We've thoroughly mapped the human identity landscape. I think it's time we cross a major conceptual boundary into machine identities. This is where the rules get stricter, more binary, and absolutely critical for administration, and of course for the AZ-104 exam.
Yeah,
We have to clearly distinguish between service principals and managed identities.
absolutely. This section defines the hard perimeter of the tenant. If you mix these two up, your automation will fail. And you could introduce enormous security risks by trying to force an identity type beyond its architectural limits.
Let's start with that hard boundary then. Scenario 6. Accessing a resource across tenants using managed identity. A classic setup. A VM running in tenant A needs to retrieve a secret from a key vault located in tenant B. We've configured the VM with a managed identity, or MI.
The immediate incorrect thought is, oh, okay, maybe I can just treat the MI like a guest user and invite it to tenant B.
Can you? Why can't I just take the MI object ID from tenant A and add it into the security principal list of tenant B's key vault access policy?
Because the entire security model of a managed identity prevents it. Managed identities cannot be used cross-tenant. They're fundamentally tethered to the resource provider that hosts them, like Azure Compute. For a VM within that specific Entra ID tenant, their security tokens are generated and scoped strictly to that local tenant boundary. They are not, by design, globally valid.
So if I try to use the MI token generated in tenant A to authenticate against a resource in tenant B, the authentication service in tenant B will just not recognize the issuer.
Precisely. Tenant B's Entra ID will look at the token, see the issuer claim, ties it back to tenant A's identity system, and just reject it. There's no federated trust pass for MIs. Therefore, the problem is structurally unsolvable using the managed identity.
So what are the two possible correct solutions? What should an admin do?
You have two primary workarounds, and both involve a bit of architectural change. First, the clean solution. If it's possible, just relocate the key vault to tenant A. Bring the resource and the identity into the same boundary. Second, the cross-tenant solution. You must use a service principal. You create an SP in tenant B, grant that SP access to the key vault, and then you configure the VM in tenant A to use the SP's credentials instead of its managed identity.
This makes the exam trap crystal clear. If the boundary is crossed, MI is out. MI is only valid within the same tenant. That is an absolute non-negotiable rule.
Right. And since managed identities are strictly internal, anything external has to rely on the service principal model. Let's look at scenario 2. Partner SaaS automation needs access. A partner is running a specialized SaaS platform, maybe a security scanning tool on their own cloud, and it needs API access to deploy configuration data into your Azure subscription.
The moment we hear runs on their own cloud, we know MI is gone. So it has to be a service principal.
Correct. The solution is to create a service principal in your tenant and grant it the necessary RBAC roles. But the real administrative challenge here is authentication. How does that external partner use the SP securely without you exchanging long-lived secrets?
If they're using a client secret, a password, that's a massive governance risk. It requires complex rotation schedules, and it's just a secret waiting to be leaked.
Exactly. The preferred architectural method, and definitely the answer the AZ-104 favors for security, is leveraging federated identity credentials. This involves setting up the SP to accept authentication from an external identity provider using OpenID Connect, or OIDC, federation. You often tie it to their own internal DevOps pipeline. This allows the partner's pipeline to assert an identity token to your Entra ID, which then issues a token for the service principal without ever requiring a shared password or certificate. It's secretless.
That secretless authentication is the modern standard. So the key takeaway is external automation always points to a service principal, and you should preferably configure it with OIDC federation for enhanced security and way simpler credential management.
And let's refine that concept with scenario 10, standard SaaS integration. This is when a commercial SaaS vendor has a pre-built product and you, the customer, need to grant its underlying service access to your environment. You don't want to manage the application, you want to use it.
The old way was the vendor telling you, hey, go create an app registration based on these details, which often led to a lot of confusion and misconfiguration.
The correct modern solution is much, much cleaner. The vendor registered the application registration and their tenant. You, the customer, you simply go through the standard consent flow. When you click Accept on that permissions dialog, Azure automatically creates a local service principal instance, a kind of representation or a shadow of the vendor's application within your tenant.
So the application's code and its core definition live externally, but its access permissions live entirely internally inside my tenant.
Exactly. And this is critical for security governance.
Yeah.
The RBAC permissions, what the application is actually allowed to do, are assigned solely to that local SP instance created within your tenant. So if the relationship ends, you, the customer, simply delete that local service principal instance, and access is instantaneously revoked. You don't have to ask the vendor to do anything. It provides the customer with the kill switch authority they absolutely need.
This last machine identity scenario takes that concept of the service principal and scales it up. So we have scenario 7, building an internal multi-tenant app. We've built a custom deployment tool that our internal team uses to manage resources across 5 different, completely separate customer tenants.
The thought of having to create and manage 5 individual SPs, 5 sets of client secrets, and track 5 different sets of RBAC roles. I mean, it's an administrative nightmare. That's the wrong approach.
Right, so the correct solution is to leverage the same design pattern the major SaaS vendors use.
It's the multi-tenant app registration. You register the application once in your home tenant, but you mark it explicitly as multi-tenant. The core application configuration resides solely with you. The magic happens during the customer onboarding process.
Which is what exactly? How does that work for each customer?
Each of your 5 customer tenants goes through that same consent process we just talked about. Upon consent, Entra ID instantiates a unique, isolated service principal in each of those customer tenants. This allows your application, running from your tenant, to assume the identity of that local SP in the customer's environment.
The benefit there is huge. You manage one application code base and one core identity definition. The customer retains local control over authorization. They assign RBAC roles, like contributor or reader, only to their local service principal instance.
And just like before, if customer C fires you, they simply delete their local SP instance, and your deployment tool loses access instantly, all without you having to touch their identity store. This is the optimal scaling model for internal tools that need cross-customer reach.
Okay, we have established the rules for humans and for machines crossing these boundaries. Now let's move into some of the more advanced configuration. We're talking about integrating completely foreign identity systems, controlling external groups, and understanding where core infrastructure policies really stop.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting.
So let's tackle scenario 11, external identity provider accessing Azure resources. Your organization utilizes an entirely separate, massive external IDP. Maybe it's Okta, Ping Identity, or even a legacy ADFS server to manage all its employee identities. But those employees also need access to Azure resources housed in your Entra tenant.
The administrative instinct, particularly if you're coming from a Windows Server background, is to start setting up directory synchronization or creating placeholder local user accounts in Entra. This is the wrong path because it forces you into managing duplicate identity stores. That leads to password sync issues and credential confusion for users.
So how do we establish trust with an entirely foreign identity provider without having to copy or sync identities?
The correct solution is federation. Specifically, Azure AD B2B Direct Federation. This is governed via the External Identities Blade in Entra ID. It involves an administrative effort where you exchange metadata, usually SAML or WSFed endpoints, with the external IDP. This handshake is what establishes the trust relationship.
So when a user from the Okta system tries to access an Azure resource, what happens in that flow?
Entra ID recognizes that the user's domain is a federated domain.
Mm-hmm.
So it redirects the authentication request back to the external IDP, which is Okta in this case.
Mm-hmm.
Okta handles the authentication, it generates a token, and it asserts that token back to Entra ID. Entra ID validates the signature, grants access, and the user signs in as if they had a native Entra account, all without a single local Entra account ever being created.
That eliminates the biggest headache, that password and lifecycle management duplication. For the AZ-104, the takeaway here seems pretty clear. Federation is the preferred method for managing external users governed by a separate IDP. You only fall back to local Entra accounts or complicated sync if federation is architecturally impossible due to legacy constraints.
Exactly. We briefly touched on groups before, but let's dive deeper with scenario 9. Assigning RBAC via external groups. A major partner is collaborating on a critical project, and they want you to assign RBAC permissions using their security groups, not your individual guest accounts. This is a request to integrate their identity governance structure directly into your authorization model.
And we already know you can't just do this automatically, right? Group membership is sensitive and can be large.
Correct. The wrong assumption is that just enabling B2B trust is enough. The right answer requires a specific advanced setting. You must enable external group membership claims via the cross-tenant access policy configuration. You need to explicitly configure your inbound trust settings to accept group claims from that specific partner tenant.
And if I fail to do that configuration, what does the user experience? What breaks?
The user authenticates successfully, but when Entra ID builds the user's token for them, the group membership claims that were asserted by the partner tenant are just silently stripped out. They're gone, because you haven't explicitly configured trust for that sensitive data. As a result, when the user tries to access a resource that relies on that group membership for authorization, access is denied. This really highlights the modularity of cross-tenant trust. You can trust the identity, you can trust the MFA, and you can separately and explicitly trust the group claims.
That's a crucial administrative detail. Now let's shift focus completely and bridge identity with infrastructure complexity. Scenario 12. Two Azure tenants share VNet resources. Tenant A's virtual machines need private, low-latency communication with specific VNets owned by Tenant B.
This is a scenario where the administrative solution crosses multiple Azure domains. The core requirement is satisfied by VNet peering, which is a networking construct. But to securely establish and manage that peering, identity is absolutely required.
The common confusion here is trying to apply identity rules to the network path itself, which isn't right.
Exactly. The network path, the VNet peering, can cross the tenant boundary. However, the administrative action required to configure and maintain that peering still requires authorization within each tenant. The solution is VNet peering with cross-tenant service principal RBAC permissions.
Okay, so walk me through the steps required for a cross-tenant VNet peering.
First, the administrators in both Tenant A and Tenant B must initiate and approve the pairing from the respective sides. Crucially, the administrator in Tenant A needs to grant required RBAC rules necessary to modify peering settings to a service principal belonging to Tenant B, and vice versa. This means Tenant A's service principal is managing Tenant B's peering endpoint, and Tenant B's service principal is managing Tenant A's endpoint.
That makes perfect sense. The identity itself doesn't cross the boundary in the same way, but we use the cross-tenant capability of the service principal to grant the other tenant's automation system the right to configure resources inside our boundary. The network access is the result. The configuration access is identity-based.
Our final scenario addresses the ultimate policy boundary, and this is centered around conditional access. So this is scenario 14. Centralized conditional access across tenants. For compliance or maybe regulatory reasons, your organization operates two entirely separate Entra tenants. We'll call them Tenant Alpha and Tenant Beta. Management requires one unified, standardized conditional access policy across both directories to ensure consistent security standards.
The wishful thinking here, I imagine, is that I can create a policy in alpha and it somehow broadcasts or synchronizes itself to beta, or that alpha's CA can evaluate a sign-in that's coming into beta.
That is the common wrong assumption, and it's the one that exposes the absolute limits of Entra ID policy governance. The governing rule here is immutable. Conditional access is tenant-specific. CA policies are bound to the directory where they are created, and they can only evaluate authentication requests directed at that specific directory.
So even with all the B2B trust and federation we've built, CA is still strictly local.
Absolutely. If you have two tenants, you must duplicate the exact CA policies in both. This duplication requirement is the ultimate reminder that while Microsoft has built excellent tools for collaboration like B2B and SPS, the core governance and policy enforcement remains intrinsically tied to the single tenant boundary.
Let's summarize that final policy boundary for the listener, just to make it stick.
Okay. In terms of governance, conditional access is strictly per tenant. Role-based access control, or RBAC, assignment is per tenant. And identity governance tools like access reviews are also per tenant unless you specifically configure those cross-tenant features, like B2B access reviews or the external group claims we discussed. Those features allow the identity information to cross, but the actual policy execution remains local.
That duality collaboration is easy, but policy consolidation is manual. That's really the core challenge of multi-tenant administration, isn't it? We've covered a tremendous amount of ground today, moving swiftly, but I think thoroughly. through 15 highly specific identity scenarios that really define the perimeter of modern Azure administration. If you can master these differences, you will not only be ready for the AZ-104, you will be operating at a true architectural level.
Let's synthesize the core decision matrix we established. I think this is the key to passing this section of the exam. Just remember the three identity archetypes and their rules of engagement. Number one, external humans require B2B guests, and access requires establishing trust in the cross-tenant access settings. Number two, external automation requires service principles, preferably utilizing that secretless authentication via OIDC federation. And three, internal automation requires managed identities. They are the safest, but they are strictly tenant local and can never cross boundaries.
And we also reiterated that crucial authorization hurdle. B2B access grants identity, but authorization requires explicit RBAC assignment, whether that's a contributor role on a resource group or a log analytics reader role specific to the data plane. Never, ever assume implicit permissions for guests.
And finally, the necessity of mastering those cross-tenant access settings. This isn't just another UI blade. It's your central hub for establishing explicit trust. This is where you configure MFA trust, group claim sharing, and define which specific external tenants are even allowed to engage in B2B collaboration with you. Ignoring these settings guarantees policy friction down the road.
Understanding these boundaries is what defines the modern perimeter. You are securing resources not just by firewalls and network segmentation alone, but by the strength and precision of your identity directory policies.
Which leads us to our final provocative thought for you to chew on. We saw in Scenario 14 that core compliance and security tools like conditional access remain strictly tenant-bound. This often requires the duplication of effort during major organizational events like mergers. So if your policies must be duplicated, what is the total hidden operational cost of that duplication? And even more critically, how do you calculate the security risk, the drift risk, of having two separate policy stacks that must be manually aligned and maintained in parallel for years?
The answer to those governance questions really define the difference between a great admin and a world-class architect. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Entra identity boundaries. We'll catch you next time.